You made it back for our last mini lecture for this week. So we are going to wrap up our discussion of somatic reflexes. And we're actually going to start with looking at the anatomy of what are called muscle spindles, which are going to be really important in understanding our reflexes. Now, many of our somatic reflexes are going to involve stretch receptors that are actually called muscle spindles. So these are a type of proprioceptors, which again are sense organs that are monitoring our body's position and moves. These basically send messages to the central nervous system, and then the brain can send motor commands back that are going to control our muscle tone and posture and help coordinate our movements as well as corrective reflexes. So the way that this works is the muscle spindle is going to communicate with the brain, and it basically is going to inform the brain of these things. It's going to tell the brain how long a muscle is at any given moment, how the body is moving, and what motor commands need to be sent to keep the body sort of in a given position or upright in a safe location. We are going to see lots of muscle spindles in muscles that require fine motor control. And so over here we can look at sort of the general structure, and I'm going to talk about a lot of these pieces, but maybe not all of them because I want to try and keep this a little bit simple. So what we're looking at here is we have sort of 7 to 8 modified muscle fibers that are enclosed in a fibrous capsule. So these are going to be our standard skeletal muscle fibers over here. Those are the ones that are going to be doing the contracting. And then inside of this sort of enclosed region, we are going to find 7 to 8 modified muscle fibers. So if we look at these, we can see that they're modified. These are called intrafusial muscle fibers, and so these are going to be the modified ones. Extrafusial are going to be our standard muscle fibers that are doing the work of the muscle or that are contracting and lifting and pulling on joints. So when we look at these modified muscle fibers, you'll see that in this central region, we lack our striations, and so these regions are not actually contracting at all, but rather they are going to help us measure how long this muscle is and what types of movements are happening in this particular area. We do have motor neurons that are going to innervate. Alpha are going to innervate our extrafusial, and those are again going to cause our contractions. Gamma are going to stimulate sort of almost partial contractions in these modified muscles. But remember that this central region isn't going to contract. So we're going to get sort of stimulation to either side and some minor contractions on those ends. But in the central region, we are not going to get any contraction. So what happens is this, again, central region, when we get contraction on either end, is going to start pulling on it. It's going to measure tension. It's going to measure length. And what it's also going to do is tell us how rapidly the length and tension and position of this muscle is changing. That information about length and the rapidity of changing is going to get sent to the central nervous system, which then can in turn monitor nearly every muscle in the body constantly and without us realizing it to make sure that we can stay upright and that we can make fine adjustments to our muscles to make sure that we stay in whatever position we're in. So again, I know I've used the rocking boat sort of discussion before, but if you're standing on a rocking boat, you're not going to think about which muscles you need to contract and relax in order to stay standing while that boat moves underneath you. We are going to use our muscle spindle fibers to do that. So these are going to be constantly monitoring and making fine adjustments to our muscles to make sure that they all stay, we maintain muscle tone, and we can maintain a specific position or posture. Now we're going to talk about 3 different types of reflexes. So we'll start with the stretch reflex. This is actually the one that we sort of detailed before. But when we have sudden stretching of a muscle, the muscle is going to respond by contracting. And the way sort of the overall pathway is we get a stimulus to our muscle spindles, which we just talked about. So those stretch receptors notice that there's a very rapid and sudden change in the length of the muscle. They are going to immediately send signals to the cerebellum. The cerebellum is going to integrate those signals, send them to the cerebral cortex, and then signal back to the muscle. And so that is going to cause the muscle to respond and usually contract or relax, depending on what exactly is going on. And so we sort of get this feedback to our synergist and anergist muscles as well, in order to make sure that we don't contract one muscle and then fall over because all of our muscles are contracted at once. It just simply doesn't work like that. So this information goes to the prime mover where we had that stretch occur, and then also to the synergist and antagonist that are involved in whatever movement we are making. So these are going to be mediated primarily by the brain. We do see some that aren't, so they are solely kept to what's going on in the spinal cord. What we're looking at here is our patellar reflex, which I talked about before, so let's just walk through what's happening. This is what's called a monosynaptic reflex arc. Monosynaptic means that we just have one synapse between an afferent and efferent neuron. So this is what we were talking about before, where we don't include an interneuron. Because we only have one synapse, we have absolutely minimized our synaptic delay, so there's really no delay at all. Okay, so let's see. We tap on our patellar ligament, which is what we have going on here. That is going to excite those muscle spindles in the quadriceps femoris and send stretch signals to the spinal cord via our afferent fiber. So we go boom into our afferent fiber. Again, we get our integrating center. We are going to then synapse. So we have two things happening. We get a synapse that's going to form with our motor fiber. We are also going to have a secondary synapse, so we get two branches off of this afferent neuron. That secondary synapse does involve an interneuron, and it is going to stimulate inhibitory motor neurons in the spinal cord. And so these inhibitory spinal motor neurons are going to prevent muscles from working against each other. So if we're trying to contract the quadriceps femoris, but we also are contracting our hamstring muscles, that is going to be problematic because we have to contract one and relax the other. So this first pathway, this first synapse, which is our monosynaptic synapse, is going to cause contraction of the quadriceps. This second pathway here, where we have our interneuron, is going to stimulate our inhibitory motor neuron and prevent the hamstring from contracting as well. So we don't want to have antagonistic movements happening at once. Next, we can look at what's called a flexor or withdraw reflex. An example would be where you are rapidly pulling your foot away from a nail that you've stepped on. The example that we see here is you're withdrawing your foot from a piece of broken glass on the beach. We call this a flexor reflex because it involves contraction of the flexors as well as relaxation of the extensors. So we get quick contraction of those flexor muscles. Boom, we pull that leg off of, or that foot off of whatever damaging substance we are standing on. And then we relax the extensors. Again, we don't want antagonistic movement of these muscles. So ultimately, this is going to cause withdrawal of the limb. This time, we are using a polysynaptic reflex arc. And so the signals are going to have to travel over many synapses on the way back to their muscles. So we are just going to look at the left panel for right now, where we have our withdraw. We step on our glass. That is going to be our stimulus because we're stimulating those pain receptors. That information is going to get sent up our afferent neurons, right? So we're following yellow right now. Again, into our integrating center, which is this ganglion, into that posterior horn of gray matter. And then we see we have a synapse here, a synapse here, a synapse here. So this is sort of we're making decisions. We're deciding which muscles need to contract and which ones need to relax. And then we get sort of multiple outputs. Some are going to go to the hamstrings because we need to relax those. Some of our afferent nerve fibers are going to go to our quadriceps because those are the ones we want to contract. And so we are going to contract those muscles and pull. This is ipsilateral, right? Nothing crosses over. It all stays on the same side of the body. It stays on the same side of the spinal cord for now. And we can withdraw that limb from injury. Now I'm going to go to the next slide. It's going to be the same image. Sort of another piece or another type of reflex is called the crossed extension reflex. In the scenario above, we are rapidly contracting the flexor muscles of one leg and actually lifting that leg off the ground to prevent injury to the body. Now, if we don't contract the extensor muscles of the opposite limb, so the contralateral side of the body, what would happen is you would fall over. In order to prevent that from happening, we are going to engage what is called the crossed extension reflex to maintain our balance, to shift our center of gravity over the leg that is still planted, so over our left leg, which is still on the ground here. The way that this happens is a branch of our afferent nerve fiber is actually going to cross contralaterally or cross over the spinal cord and synapse with neurons in the other side. So again, we start with our receptors, we get that afferent integration center into the lateral horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord, and these messages are going to synapse around in that region to come back and deal with what's happening on the ipsilateral side. Here, we also see that we do have a neuron or a branch of this neuron that crosses over to the other side of the body, integrates with neurons on this side, and is going to cause the extensors to contract, so the hamstrings to contract, and our flexors to relax, or the quadriceps to relax on the opposite side of the body, so that this foot stays planted and we don't try and raise both legs at once, and thereby falling on top of this broken glass and damaging ourselves even more. So when we say, we also could call this a contralateral reflex arc, so that would be input and output on opposite sides of the body, and an intersegmental reflex, which means that input and output could happen at different levels. So this message could actually go up a segment in the spinal cord or down a segment in the spinal cord, depending on which muscles are going to need to be stiffened or extended based on the scenario or the damage that's occurring. All of this is going to require coordination mediated by both the cerebellum and the cerebral cortex. All right, and that is the end of this chapter, or this week's lectures. Next week we will move into the autonomic nervous system, and that will be our last set of material. So we are beginning to wrap up this semester.